got to make whatever he wants and take it with his own hands. Poor people.
Good evening. Hello. Welcome back to Another Now. That's a segment of DMTV, a product of lockdown number 1. And here we are with DMTV again in Another Now during lockdown number 2. I don't know where you are, whether there is a lockdown, but you know where I am, which is in Greece, and like in most of Europe and a large number of places around the world, the complete failure of governments and the whole system to prop up our public health system has led to yet another lockdown. Let's see how this whole thing pans out. So Another Now and DiEM25, or not DiEM25, I'm wrong on this, DMTV, in a sense, we're products of lockdown. But there have been other products of lockdown, haven't there? Mr. Jeff Bezos, CEO of Amazon, has made the mint out of lockdown. He amassed more than $85 billion during lockdown. Now, the reason why I mentioned that, of course, is that you may have heard that DiEM25 and the Progressive International, we have been in the business of organizing. When was it? Actually, it was only on last Friday, on Black Friday, a global campaign against Amazon. Now, why did we do that? Well, Amazon is not just any business. It represents a major break, even from capitalism. It's not just Amazon, of course. It's Facebook, it's Netflix, the whole of the fangs, big tech. Come to think of it, back in the 1920s, even the American establishment, Theodore Roosevelt, rose up against the huge trusts, the large corporations. Remember if you've heard of it, the antitrust legislation that broke down Rockefeller's Standard Oil mega firm that was monopolizing the market for oil in the United States. So there's nothing new about complaining about cartels and large operations like Standard Oil, like Amazon. What is new about Amazon is the reach of the monopoly. You see, it's one thing to say that you are walking down the high street in an English town or Main Street in an American town, and you've got one large shop owned by a chain that effectively monopolizes everything, like Walmart. It's not a good thing. It's not good even if you are a liberal, pro-market, spirit. But imagine a situation where you're walking down the street and the asphalt, the pavement, the benches, the lampposts, the walls, the houses, every shop that there is, the post office, the air you breathe, the water that you drink from a tap, everything is owned by one company. That is what big tech are doing. And it is this immense concentration of wealth which leads to a situation where somebody like Jeff Bezos can, practically, to all intents and purposes, become richer during his sleep. That is the situation we are facing today. Wealth begets wealth, courtesy of being concentrated. Not because of innovation, not because of any contribution. Look, Jeff Bezos deserves to be rich. He's a smart entrepreneur. He's had this idea a long time ago. He looked at the internet. He thought, okay, now what can I sell over the internet in a context that cannot be replicated by the analog world? And he thought, okay, books. He didn't give a damn about books, but he thought of them as items. As he says in a famous video, there are 3 million books constantly in print worldwide. There can be no bookshop that sells 3 million books, but there can be an Amazon.com from which you can actually purchase any of these 3 million books. So that was a clever idea. So I don't begrudge him the fact that he's rich. But you know what? $200 billion plus cannot be explained as a result of innovation. it is a kind of feudalism. It's a kind of techno-feudalism. It's from the courtesy of the fact that he owns the whole thing, the main street, the high street, the complete thing. And the result, of course, is such exorbitant power leads to immense exploitation of workers who work like robots in warehouses under conditions that are not fit for robots. The environment, which, just look at the facts and the figures. The footprint, the carbon footprint of Amazon is greater than 2/3 of countries around the world. Look at taxation. They pay no tax, 0% corporation tax. And they do this completely legally, right? Completely legally. So we have to start somewhere. We need, whether we're Marxists, like I'm pronouncing myself to be, or even supporters of competitive capitalism in a sense, we need to combine forces, and we need to send a message to Jeff Bezos that Mr. Bezos, the days of immunity and impunity are over. This is what the Progressive International did last Black Friday. This is what we did as DiEM25. We organized the International Trade Union Council, various activist organizations, the Tax Justice Network, Oxfam joined us. We had the support of Amnesty International. 200 million members is the number of affiliates of all the organizations and affiliates of the coalition that the Progressive International put together last Black Friday. It's only the beginning. It really is only the beginning. But we have to start somewhere. And this is where we're starting, in the middle of lockdown, because it is essential that the powerless, abandoned workers working in an Amazon warehouse in Germany or in New Jersey or in India, for that matter, they know that the progressives of the world are behind them, and that we have the capacity to do that which so far only the bankers and the fascists have done, that is to internationalize our struggle, internationalize our campaign. The bankers are doing it very well. Whether you speak to, a Swiss banker or an Indian banker or an American banker or a Greek banker for that matter, if you go to Davos, thankfully the chances of that are minimal, especially this year, and you talk to any of the people there, they give you the chapter and verse, the same story of what is the right way forward, what rationality compels us to do as a species, and so on. Of course, this is all self-serving. But they have unity. They are practicing internationally, just as the fascists do. Whether you're Donald Trump, Salvini, Modi, the Greek government these days, which is veering in that direction. Let me not start on that. The Hungarian government and so on, their xenophobia, their misanthropy, their hunger for power and authoritarianism, they're also speaking and singing from the same hymn book or sheet, for that matter. So that's what we're trying to do. That was the whole point about Black Friday. But let me answer a question first that I encountered, where else? In the social media since last Friday. Mr. Varoufakis, aren't you being a hypocrite? You're selling your books through Amazon. How dare you ask of us that we campaign together with you against Amazon? Well, let's get a few things absolutely crystal clear. Yes, my books are available on Amazon. But firstly, just in case you haven't heard, authors do not own their books once they've signed a contract with the publisher. So even if I don't want them to be available on Amazon, there's nothing I can do. I do not choose, this book's price. It is the publisher that does. But that's not the main point. The main point I want to make is this. I also use the health service. I also use public transport. Does this mean it is hypocritical if there is a strike by nurses for me to support them? Is it hypocritical if there is a strike by underground or metro drivers or staff that I support them just because I believe in using the services that they provide, that they provide? No, of course not. So let's get this out of contention as a potential criticism. There is no doubt that we must support small bookshops. There's a new bookshop dot something. Go and find it. I don't remember it off by heart now. A competitor to Amazon that effectively is an alliance of small bookshops that provide a capacity for you and for me to buy books over the internet very easily without going through Amazon. So we must support all that, but let's not accept divide and rule strategies by those who try to point out hypocrisies that are simply not there. Okay, now there are some questions that are coming through. Let me get to some of them before I do that which I truly want to do. Okay, here's one. It comes from, it's a critical one, from a Greek fellow, Tassos Morphis, I believe is his name. He says, "Dear Yanis, what do you think about Bezos' ownership of the Washington Post and the fact that he's turned the newspaper into one of the most innovative media organizations in the world?" You know what, Tassos? Good on Bezos for doing that. Washington Post was a basket case. It was going under. Rich man comes along, buys it, saves it. Now, do I read the Washington Post? I don't, but I'm glad it exists, and I'm glad that it hasn't died, and I'm glad that it's not only Google, Facebook, and Amazon that actually circulate the news and commentary. So, good on him. But what does this have to do with our campaign against Amazon? Nothing. We are not begrudging, as I said, even the fact that he's wealthy. What I am putting forward is the proposition that no one should have the right to have so much concentrated wealth and power in any society under any circumstances. Carmine Tedesco asks, can Amazon be nationalized? No, it can't. And it can't be because it is, global. It owns the bloody world. So, unless we have a global government, which you don't, and I'm not even proposing it, we can't really talk about nationalizing Amazon. But there are things we can do. For a start, we can tax Amazon. Our party, Mera25, on Wednesday, 2 days from now, is going to be tabling an amendment to a bill. We're a small party of opposition, but we will do it as a matter of principle, that introduces a digital tax on all the FANGs, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Googles, the Apples, the Spotifys, Netflix, and so on, because it is about time they start paying. And if you keep taxing them on profits, they report zero profits. They have the capacity to hide profits. They have no capacity to hide revenues. But there's something much, much deeper that we can do. We can rethink property rights over corporations, and particularly the share market. But I'll come back to this a little bit later. Here we have another question coming from, just give me a second, because I'm reading them as they are appearing. This is the beauty of live DMTV. Vince Roy, how did I come up with, this is in this book, the suggestion that we can replace all taxes in society by a 5% revenue tax on corporations? Is that going to be enough for government to function? Well, don't forget that profits are a tiny percentage of revenues. So a 5% of revenues is a lot more than 20%, 25% of profits. Besides that, my proposal, and I'll come to this when I speak a little bit later about another now, which of course comes from this book, right? I'm plugging it. I know it's awful, isn't it? No, actually it isn't, because my heart is in this book. There will be a second source and a third source of taxation in my ideal democratic market socialist society. A tax on land that should be substantial, and a tax on emissions like CO2. These three taxes together will generate a lot more tax revenues for governments compared to what we now get from sales taxes and from taxation on corporate taxes, on corporate profits, as well as incomes. But I'll refer to this again a little bit later, if I may. Let's take one more question. Is there anything we can do, Katarina Popovich asks, as individuals about Amazon and other big companies and their dominating role? Well, Katarina, this is a pass that I am going to accept, happily, in soccer terms, because this is what we are doing. The Progressive International and DiEM25, with the campaign that we started on Black Friday, we are kickstarting a process whereby you can actually participate in these campaigns, and you can actually help us design these campaigns and become part of, organizing them. The more, the merrier. Okay, now, speaking of another now, this book, in which I try to effectively answer the question: if you don't like capitalism, mate, and if you think that capitalism is already morphing into a morbid and dystopic variety of post-capitalism, what's the alternative? I try to answer this by writing a science fiction novel in which I imagine what could have happened in 2008. Remember, 2008 was our generation's 1929, as I keep saying. It was a discontinuity in the historical trajectory. Nothing after 2008 will ever resemble what happened before 2008. COVID-19 came along and turbocharged all the changes that began in 2008, the stagnation, the socialism for the very, very few, the financiers, the austerity, permanent austerity for almost everyone else. This was happening between 2008 and 2020, and COVID-19 came and gave it a big wallop, just boosted it beyond belief. But imagine, could we have done things differently in 2008 instead of just the Occupy Wall Street great meetings that we had? We had so much fun. The Indignados meeting in the squares, public squares in Spain, the Aganaktismeni in Greece, Occupy the city in London, and so on. After a while, either we were kicked out by police or we got tired and went home, because however beautiful those occasions for getting together were, they were not really a ramming rod against capitalism. So I try to imagine what, an OC, not Occupy the City, but an ossify capitalism rebellion could have been like in 2008. So in this book, there's a chapter in which, actually, the preceding chapter is one where I describe how corporations work in this market socialist system that emerged after 2008, 2009, in my fantasy book, right, in my science fiction novel. But the difficulty as an author, as a writer, was to write the next chapter, which is called How Capitalism Died. There, once I had more or less described the market socialist foundation, that is the corpus syndicalist corporation where there is no owner. Every employee owns a single share. They have one vote, one employee, one share, one vote. You move to another company, you take your capital with you, but you leave the share behind. So effectively, you have no share markets. And if you have no share markets and you have the central bank giving a digital account to each one of us, then suddenly, financialization goes away. Financial markets disappear. You don't even need to ban them. They become extinct. Anyway, that's the previous chapter. But the question is, how could such an economic and social and political system ever come about? Don't we need a revolution for that? The answer is, of course we do. But what would it look like? So will you allow me to read the relevant part from the chapter entitled How Capitalism Died? The leader of the revolution, of the OC rebellion, the Ossify Capitalism rebellion, is a woman called Esmeralda. Esmeralda, in my fantasy, right? She's a fictitious character. Was working for Lehman Brothers or Goldman Sachs, doesn't matter whom. She was renting her delightful capacities to. And when everything started going pear-shaped in Wall Street, she sent a circular, an email to various financial engineers like herself, asking them to join forces with her in order to bring the system down. So here we go. This segment of the chapter is called Techno Rebels. Esmeralda had worked for one of the large financial houses until just before the crash, and thus understood their inner workings well. Using her expertise, her crowd shorters, this is what she called her organization, undermined the central bank's efforts surgically and stylishly. They realized what few understood. By privatizing everything, capitalism had made itself supremely vulnerable to financial guerrilla attacks. Specifically, the consequence of having privatized all the utility companies was that every telephone, water, or electricity bill incurred by residents, wherever, in Britain or in the United States, in Europe, indeed in Asia, were owned and owed to some private corporation. However, the corporation, the water utility for instance, had pre-sold these payments ages before to some financier. What exactly had the financier bought? The right to collect the future revenue streams from the little people. And what did the financier do with that right? He sliced it up into tiny chunks and placed them in different derivatives, which in turn were sold on to other financiers globally. Esmeralda and her comrades had the technical skills to unpick the contents of every derivative. Painstakingly, they wrote software that could identify precisely which chunk of debt within each derivative was owed by each household, when each chunk of a bill or a debt repayment was due, to whom it was owed, and who owned the specific derivative at every point in time. Using this vast database, they were then able to contact households, most of which were outraged by the bankers' behavior, remember 2008? And the bailouts they were set to receive, and invite them to participate in low-cost, targeted short-term payment strikes, or crowd shorting, as Esmeralda called these campaigns, thus the name of the organization, Crowd Shorters. Remember, this is early 2009. People are enraged at the banks, at the national privatized companies, and so on. The Crowd Shorters' pitch to residents was simple. In fact, one of the first of them, a circular sent by Esmeralda to Yorkshire residents, is now commemorated in the other now, the alternative universe, on a plaque that adorns the Houses of Parliament in London. It said, "Help us bring down those profiting from your exorbitant water bill while you are struggling to put food on the table. Just delay paying your water bill for 2 months. And don't worry about the late payment fee. We are crowdsourcing funds to compensate you. United we stand, divided we fall." Similar plaques are on display in the entrance of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., or even the Greek Parliament on Syntagma Square. Well, that's my fantasy, right? I can do anything I want with it. The uptake was breathtaking. People all over the United Kingdom, soon the world, began to take great pleasure in tracking and heeding the Crowd Shorters' calls. Their meticulously coordinated payment strikes caused cascades of crashes in the derivatives markets, which spilled over into the major stock exchanges. Within 3 weeks, the central banks realized it would be impossible to refloat the bankers' trillions of dollars worth of securitized debt, while at the same time, the privatized utilities were going bust and demanding bailouts also. Unable to convince Congress to pump the missing trillions into Wall Street for a second and then a third time in the space of a few months, the United States federal government had to allow Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, and the other behemoths to be wound down. The repercussions were immense. Europe's banks, which were in a far worse state than America's, shut up shop too. The City of London was in meltdown. Governments were forced to nationalize the failing utilities. The Fed, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, even the People's Republic of China had no alternative but to step into the void and provide citizens with bank accounts. While they played a central role in sinking global finance, Esmeralda and the crowd-shorters could not have sparked the OC revolution on their own. Wrecking an already collapsing Wall Street was one thing. Ossifying capitalism was quite another. This is where other techno-rebels came into the picture, spontaneously. Recognizing pension funds as the largest shareholders in the great corporations, a band of radicalized traders working out of Mumbai's financial center and calling themselves Solidarity Sourcing Proxies, sole sourcers for short, decided it was time to target globalization's most ludicrous racket. Drawing inspiration from the crowd-shorters, the sole sourcers invited people to nominate companies around the world with the worst record of zero-hour contracts, low pay, carbon footprints, working conditions, and the tendency to downsize in order to boost their share prices. Millions of people from all over the world pitched in to name the worst offenders. Then, the sole sources organized a mass withholding of pension contributions to the pension funds that own shares in those companies. The mere rumor that the sole sources had targeted a particular pension fund turned out to be enough to send its shares crashing and to cause an exodus of worried investors from equity funds related to it. The sole sources eventually needed only to send to a pension fund a list of the companies it wanted it to divest from, and the fund would do so immediately, lest its incoming pension contributions dried up. Realizing their power, the sole sources spread their wings globally and began to make more ambitious and highly sophisticated demands, not merely for divestment from unscrupulous employers and environment-destroying corporations, but for reforms to corporate law. Inspired by a flat management structure pioneered once upon a time in Washington state, they managed to take the first step towards prescribing by law the corporate model, one person, one share, one vote. By early 2010, the sole sources had been joined by another group of techno-rebels, calling themselves Blade Runners. Remember the movie? In homage to, of course, Rick Deckard, who else? They thought of themselves, the Blade Runners, as neo-Luddites, even choosing as their patron figure Lord Byron, the poet laureate of the original Luddite movement. The Blade Runners did not fear technology. They celebrated the Luddites as history's most misunderstood figures, whose vandalism of machines was a protest not against automation, but against social arrangements that used technological innovation to deprive the majority of their dignity and life prospects. Indeed, the Blade Runners embraced digital platforms, even the rise of artificial intelligence, but were adamant that such machines should be utilized in the cause of shared prosperity, not as instruments of neo-feudalism or of a class war by the few against the many. The Blade Runners' first target was big tech, mega corporations with monopoly power that rendered them so rich they required neither Wall Street nor pension funds for their capital. Akechi, one of their early leaders, had worked for Microsoft in the 1990s. In early 2009, Akechi proclaimed that Google had inadvertently invented a new human right: the right to freely available and instantly accessible information. The problem with inventing a human right, Akechi explained playfully to a director at Google once, is that you lose the right, mate, to monopolize its provision, and most certainly to profit from supplying it. The Blade Runners organized mass consumer strikes, targeting one big tech company at a time. Their first successful mobilization was aimed at Amazon. Akechi issued a global call to boycott Amazon for a day in support of doubling hourly pay in its warehouses around the world. That day of inaction, as the Blade Runners called it, caused less than a 10% drop in Amazon's usual revenues, but that was enough for Amazon immediately to concede a 50% pay rise. Encouraged by their success, the Blade Runners embarked on many more campaigns of widening scope. Rallying support via social media, the Blade Runners' Days of Inaction became worldwide events, enjoying mass participation, especially by the young, until they needed only to announce their next tech target for the share price of that company to fall precipitously and for there to be relentless scrutiny of its directors and their practices online. When in early 2012, they brought down Facebook and gained legal recognition for an individual's property rights over their private data, the Blade Runners knew they had grown sufficiently powerful to make history and effect serious societal change. And around the same time, the Blade Runners teamed up with the Environs in order to hasten the demise of the fossil fuel industry. Together, they forced panicking governments to introduce stringent limits to pollutants, to reduce net carbon targets to zero by 2025, remember this is in 2012, and even to limit land clearing and cement production. Some influential corporations recognized that these constraints presented them with opportunities to profit from clean energy. But the Ossify capitalism rebels, the OC rebels, made it a condition for not targeting them that they would drop out of the stock markets and give a single non-tradable share to each member of their staff, thus laying the foundation for the corporation's conversion to this anarcho-syndicalist model: one person, one employee, one share, one vote. Within 3 years, the Crowdshorters, the Sole Sources, the Blade Runners, and the Environments had formed a highly effective network of targeted activism that the oligarchy without frontiers could not withstand. This was an extract from the chapter How Capitalism Died. It's my fantasy of a spontaneous movement of different groups that use modern technologies and all the facilities that we have at our fingertips, apps, the internet, and so on, in order to bring capitalism down. Capitalism is already, in any case, morphing, as I said at the beginning, into a kind of feudalism, techno-feudalism, and Amazon is an excellent example of that, as is Facebook. Is it not time that we used those resources against the beast which is now in the process of devouring the prospects of humanity and, indeed, the capacity of this planet to reproduce itself? I'm going to go back to some questions, right? And then read another part, if I may. Okay, here we have another Greek who asks me a difficult question. Christos is his name. He says, DiEM25 seeks to stabilize capitalism through the Green New Deal for Europe. Now that you have a post-capitalist blueprint in Another Now, does that change the plan? Why not use this crisis to fight for post-capitalism directly and demand all companies democratize? Well, Christo, it's not either or, it's both. The Green New Deal is something we can do today. Technically speaking, if you think about it, Franklin Roosevelt in 1933 came in, introduced the New Deal, not because he was a socialist, not because he wanted to change capitalism, but because he was a patrician who understood that unless you shift money from the money markets and you press it into service for public goods, for investment into good quality jobs or jobs that actually pay people to survive, that unless you do that, it's all over, it's game over, even from a capitalist perspective. The New Deal would never have been effected without the Communist Party and communist organizations in the United States. Those of you who don't know this history, go and find it out. The communists, who were strong in the 1930s in the United States, helped Roosevelt introduce the New Deal. They were not wrong to do it. They were absolutely right, because the first objective of left-wingers, of progressives, must be harm minimization, to look after people who are starving, to look after people who are not just left behind, but held behind. Because if we don't look after them, the fascists will, the Mussolinis, the Trumps, the Salvinis, and then we will lose them. And then we will end up with a liberal establishment calling them deplorables and losing them forever. So the Green New Deal, whether it is in Europe, in America, in Africa, in Asia, in an international Green New Deal that I believe the Progressive International must be pushing for, starting today, is a bridge. It is the bridge that we need between the capitalism that is morphing into a dystopia today and any opportunity, any chance we have for a future, another now, in which we can have a democratic economic life. Here's another question by Nuno Ribeiro. How can we escape the logic of being treated as consumers instead of citizens? Are there spaces we should invest our time and money in that also undermine monopolies? Nuno, allow me to say that the only way we can stop ourselves from effectively being converted into robots, into consuming units that slavishly, buy what they want and want what they buy, is through, firstly, critical thinking, and far more importantly, through collective action. And this is why I believe that what the Progressive International started on Black Friday, last Friday, is so important, because it gives us an opportunity to act globally and strike locally, and implement actions at a local level that make us feel connected to our neighbors, while at the same time being part of a transnational movement, of an international movement. All right, let me go to another question, if I may, if I find it. Here's one. How can we overcome the natural tendency of humans to overpower each other? Now that comes from a fellow that has just hit a nerve in my heart, because this is, a great source of concern that I always had. Anyone who has been in a left-wing party, in a trades union, indeed in a meeting, notices the inexorable tendency of human beings to be drawn, lured to power. Don't forget that the Gulag was created by communists for communists, by the left for the left. Every revolution has a tendency to eat its own children. How do we stop that from happening? And how do we overcome the natural disposition, the natural, how shall I put it, pessimism of the human spirit? This gives me an opening for another reading, if I may. I am going to now jump a few chapters, go towards the end of the book, where there are two fellows. One is my mad scientist, Costa, who is a tech enthusiast turned tech-phobic. He's responsible for the technological innovations that go wrong, and in the end, we have access to the other now. That doesn't matter. But he's speaking to a young man in his late teens who is depressed. He has a neoliberal mother, a professor of economics. That says it all, I think. But in any case, a young man whose number one fear in life is that others are going to overpower him. He feels that he lives in a war of all against all. I think the reason why I gave him the word Thomas is because it alludes to Thomas Hobbes and this very pessimistic view of the world, of society, as a battlefield in which if you don't overpower others, others are going to overpower you. And where the only reason why we might have a state is so that the Leviathan, the state, can have all this coercive power to keep us all in awe to quote from Thomas Hobbes. Thomas is a depressed young man, and here's a conversation that he has with Costa, who is a Renaissance figure. He's an engineer, but also a romantic who thinks that it is possible to overcome power without concentrated power. And here's the conversation. Costa is explaining to Thomas, if you want to understand what makes some people powerful and others pushovers, then you need only compare the stories of Chris and of Akechi. Akechi is the leader of the Blade Runners that I mentioned before, who organizes people against big tech. Chris, who is Chris? I won't read it out, I'll just remind you who Chris is. It's Chris Smalls, the Amazon employee who at some point during the first lockdown decided to organize a walkout because of the unhygienic conditions and the very low pay in the warehouse in which he was working somewhere in Staten Island, I believe, in the United States. And we all know what happened. I think we do, don't we? The board of directors even had a discussion about how to vilify Chris, how to portray him in the media as a bitter man who put his fellow employees' lives at risk by refusing to self-isolate and so on and so forth. I'm not sure what the story is, but in the end, while Jeff Bezos was getting incredibly richer than he already was, Chris left to his own devices, even though many of us signed petitions in favor of his reinstatement and in support of him. There was no global action in favor of Chris. So that's what the story of Chris. And what Costa is suggesting to Thomas is you have to compare the story of Chris and Akechi. And here we are. During the pandemic, while most companies were shedding jobs, putting 30 million Americans on the dole in a single month, Amazon backed the trend and appeared to a swathe of Americans like a cross between the Red Cross, delivering essential parcels to confined citizens, and Roosevelt's New Deal, hiring 100,000 extra staff and paying them a couple of extra dollars an hour to boot. Of course, behind the facade, the reality that Chris Smalls protested against was grim. In its warehouses, Amazon treated its human workers as fungible, expendable units reducible to their physical capacity to pick and pack. Good luck to anyone who protested at unhygienic facilities or a lack of protective equipment or low sick pay. That was the ugly reality behind Amazon's elevation from a near monopoly to something closer to a state within a state. Young Thomas now responds to Costa and says, all power to Bezos. If this small guy couldn't hack it at Amazon, he could have left anyway. No one asked him to work there. If you can't take care of yourself, that's your lookout. Costa had expected, even hoped for this reaction. He anticipated that Thomas would see Chris as a weakling whose sacrifice was an unavoidable corollary of Jeff Bezos' mesmerizing will to power. In fact, he sympathized with Thomas's inability to care about Amazon's ethics. How could it be otherwise for a young man overflowing so conspicuously with sadness and who felt as powerless as he did? The boy's yearning for power compelled him to admire and submit to it wherever he encountered it. Maybe so, said Costa. But there's another kind of power, entirely different but equally overwhelming, more powerful than Amazon and Bezos, it turns out. And we can see it in the story of Akechi and his Blade Runners. Costa described their days of inaction and the successes they had in securing pay rises for the Amazon workforce, but Thomas remained skeptical. Bezos might have thrown them a bone to keep them quiet, Thomas said, but I don't see how a bunch of consumers could ever weaken a megalith like Amazon enough to enable its takeover by the Chris Smalls of this world. Power always rests on the law of large numbers, Costa replied. No despot, oligarch, or entrepreneur has enough power to rule millions without their tacit consent. The truth about despotic power lies not in the despot's weapons, bank accounts, or computer servers, but in the minds of those the despot controls. As long as the many believe they are powerless, they remain so. In that sense, Bezos and Akechi were not as different as you might think, Thomas, said Costas. The key to assembling immense power, Costa went on, is to aggregate the tiny capacities of many, many people. Bezos did this slowly, gradually building up Amazon's overwhelming appeal as the path of least resistance for countless consumers, vendors, and workers. All he needed was for millions to learn instinctively to think of Amazon whenever they wanted to buy a book or a gadget or any household item quickly. And of course, he needed to keep prices low, courtesy of an army of workers with no option but to accept robot-like, soul-destroying, low-paid warehouse jobs. Akechi's army, by contrast, followed in the tiny footsteps of the Lilliputians who immobilized Gulliver. It was hard for little people to believe they had power, Costa explained. It took inspirational leadership to persuade them that they did. And then it took serious organization combined with smart strategizing for that belief to have any effect. Akechi's strategy was to start small, but aim high. His Blade Runner's days of inaction required of consumers only tiny sacrifices, but delivered confidence-boosting rewards. Not visiting a website for a day cost consumers next to nothing. But from the very start, thanks to Akechi's global reach, it translated into large costs for corporations like Amazon. Immediately, the Lilliputians saw the effect they could have, and the days of inaction became opportunities for feeling part of an effective movement. Whereas previous protest movements took effort and commitment on the part of all involved, Akechi's innovation, according to Costa, was to offer disheartened folks the chance to make a difference without personally sacrificing that much at all. And in the same way that Bezos shored up Amazon by broadening its power base, from merely selling stuff over the internet to cornering the market for cloud computing and expanding into artificial intelligence, so Akechi's Blade Runners widened their power base by combining the days of inaction with the campaigns of Esmeralda's crowd shorters and with those of the Soul Sources, the Environs, and the rest of the OC rebels. Bezos and Akechi were equally talented at amassing power, Costa concluded. The basic difference was that Bezos used people power to milk people, while Akechi used power to empower them. Thomas had been listening intently. Costa inferred from his silence that he didn't quite know whether to be impressed or dismissive. Sensing his vacillation, Costa chose a different approach. Forget the politics and look at it aesthetically, he suggested. The force assembled by Akechi is more beautiful than the blunt and boring power of an ultra-rich man and his sycophantic henchmen. If you were to put the two forces to music, Bezos would sound like Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. Akechi's like Beethoven's Ninth. As Thomas and Costa continued their discussion, Eva, that's Thomas's mum, reflected on her son's character and the relationship that was taking shape before her. Costa's musical references would have been lost on the young man. But had Thomas been familiar with the two musical works, Eva was sure he would have chosen the Valkyries every time. Beethoven's Ode to Joy required an optimism of the spirit that her son lacked. She felt keenly that it was the absence of a father figure in his life, and so on. I'm going back to the story, but the point I want to make, friends, comrades, fellow travelers, the point that I was trying to make in that chapter is that it's not enough to be right. It's not enough to organize. It's not enough to create large power by aggregating, in a Lilliputian sense, the small power of each one of us. We need simultaneously to care about the Thomases of the world. the young men, in particular men, the defective sex, let's face it, that look up to people like Jeff Bezos, that they look at, Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, back in the 1920s and 30s, Mussolini, and in a kind of sadistic and masochistic way, enjoy the idea of their power because they feel that somehow they're connected to it. We need to win the battle against the Amazons of the world, against the concentrated power of the financiers, but also the power against the dark side in the heart of very powerless people, whom we must never denigrate as deplorables, and whose pain we must feel as if it is our own. On this note, I bid you farewell. There will be another Now next month. DMTV will be here. Again and again, there will be different programs. Let's see how long this pandemic lasts. Let's see how we can organize in order to ensure we don't go back to normal, because there was nothing normal about what was going on before COVID-19 visited us. Carpe diem.